Formation of a Turkish-Islamic mass on Bulgarian lands. In the Ottoman period, the Muslim and Turkish population continued to grow. Particularly rapid changes in the structure of the population occurred in the first centuries after the Ottoman invasion. These demographic changes have long been the subject of research by specialists. Based on the textbooks and partial statistical data from the 19th century, researchers are trying to reveal the factors that contributed to the growth of the mass of Muslims. Different opinions are expressed on this issue, different hypotheses are launched. Some consider Islamization to be the main factor, others, colonization. In recent years, the notion that the two factors are combined has come to dominate. However, the debate over which of the two factors was decisive continues. The objective analysis of historical facts forces the conclusion that colonization played a decisive role. Many researchers, including Konstantin Jacek and others, note the presence of a long process of resettlement of Turkic and Turkish elements from Anatolia to Rumelia. According to the Turkish historian Ömer Barkan, the formation of the Ottoman Empire was connected not only with military conquests, but also with migration. He explains the changes in the ethnic composition of the population in Rumelia mainly with colonization. The thesis of mass colonization also prevailed in Bulgarian historiography until the 1970s. After that, however, its role began to be underestimated. Indeed, individual researchers continue to accept the thesis of the presence of colonization. However, according to them, it was not massive. In fact, as confirmed by historical sources, already in the course of its invasion, the Ottoman Central Power began to transfer the Turkish Muslim population to the Balkans. During the first 2 centuries after the invasion, the purposeful settlement and natural migration of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes continued. From the Ottoman chronicles of the 15th century, it is clear that Murad I (1362–1389) and Bayezid I (1389–1401) transferred to Rumelia separate restless nomadic groups from Anatolia, especially from the region of Balıkesir and Manisa. In the history of Ashokpashazade, the relocation of a disobedient nomadic tribe, by order of Bayezid I, from the region of Sarukan to the region of Plovdiv, is noted. It is clear that the central government sought to solve several problems through colonization. Undoubtedly one of them, as it is evident from the history of Ashokpashazade, was the resettlement of the unruly tribes on the newly conquered lands. The initial colonization had above all a military strategic goal, namely, to ensure military potential near the area of hostilities. Parallel to this important matter was the restoration of economic life. In the newly conquered areas, the Ottoman state carried out a special demographic policy. Its systematic promotion was started by Murad I and Yildirim Bayezid. Thus, the settlement of Turkish Muslim contingents became a permanent policy, although in different periods it was carried out with different intensity. The specific ways and dimensions of colonization are clarified in the works of Turkish historians Ömer Barkan, M.T. Gökbilgin, and some historians from the Balkan countries. One of the main forms was the Yuruk settlement. According to Konstantin Jacek, they got their name from the verb yürümek, to walk, which corresponds to a rugger or a nomad. According to Byzantine chroniclers, these Turkish nomads were shepherds who summered in the mountains and wintered in the plains. The first information about the settlement of nomadic tribes in Rumelia is from the time of Murad I. It is mentioned about the transfer of people from Konya and Yuruks to separate regions of the Balkans. In the 14th century, certain groups from the Menemen field were settled in Plovdiv, from Galibolu, in Thrace, and from Saruhan, in Ceres. When the number of Yuruks grew, their status was legally regulated by the Khananame of Fatih Sultan Mehmed II, 1451–1481. By the middle of the 15th century, they mainly performed military tasks, and from the middle of the 16th century, military and administrative tasks. In Rumelia, they were engaged mainly in engineering support and rear operations. By virtue of the Khanan Nami, the Eunuchs were divided into regiments, which at first consisted of 24, and from the middle of the 15th century, of 30 soldiers. All Eunuchs were grouped into 6 corps, bearing the name of the respective region from which they came, or the name of the tribal leader. This organization basically survived until the end of the 17th century. Based on the available ledgers for the period from 1543 to 1666, the Turkish historian M.T. Gökbilgin, in his monographic study on the role, organization, and movement of the Eunuchs, found that their numbers increased in the 15th century, and from the beginning of the 17th century began to decrease. The downward trend can be explained by the expansion of the Ottoman state, the gradual decay of the military system, and other reasons. The Eunuchs were also assigned special tasks on the Bulgarian lands. Above all, parts of the core of the so-called Naldican Eunuchs were settled here. This core consisted of 196 ojaks, hearths, in 1543, 243 in 1602, and 112 in 1609. According to Gökbilgin's calculations, the Eunuchs of the Naldican Corps together with their families numbered about 50,000 people. The majority of them were accommodated in Stara Zagora, Yambol and Kazanluk, where there were 92 ojaks, and in Plovdiv and Pazardzik, Tartar Pazardzik, 65. A considerable part of the corps, 55 ojaks, was located in northeastern Bulgaria. There were such ojaks almost all over the country. However, they were not numerous in all regions. In the region of Veliko Tarnovo, Haskovo, and others, the number of ojaks varied between 4 to 5. The Tanrudag Eunuchs were significantly more numerous. In 1543, the men of this corps numbered 328, and in 1591, 420. According to Gökbilgin, together with the members of their families, the corps united about 100,000 people. They were settled mainly in the Black Sea and northeastern Bulgaria. By 1642, in Dobruja, which was successively included in the Nikopol and Silistra regions, the number of ojaks reached 220. A significant part of the Kojarjuk Eunuchs were located on the Bulgarian lands, united in 12 ojaks in 1543 and in 180 ojaks in 1581. There were 30 of their ojaks in Yambol and 14 ojaks in Varna and Shumen. The most numerous were the Thessaloniki, peasant, Eunuchs, 550 ojaks in 1543. Of these, however, only about 78 ojaks were located on Bulgarian lands. Their presence was more significant in Silistra, 26 ojaks, in Plovdiv, 10, and in Pazardzik, 7. Ovchipoli and Vizan Eunuchs were less common in Bulgarian lands. In 1691, with a special Hatu Humayan, written document, of the Sultan, the Eunuch Corps were reorganized. The Eunuchs themselves were declared Evladu Fatihan, children of conquerors, which meant that the ojaks would now be filled from among their descendants. During the Tanzimat, reform period, the corps were finally disbanded. Their members became ordinary subjects who were obliged to serve in the army and pay the corresponding taxes. Together with the Eunuchs, many Tatars were settled on Bulgarian lands. They had the same status, that's why in some areas they were considered Eunuchs. According to Byzantine, Arab and Turkish sources, the first wave of Tatars were resettled on the instructions of Bayezid I. They were settled mainly in Provadia, Plovdiv and Stara Zagora. According to the transcripts from 1543, there were 21 ojaks in Provadia region. The second significant settlement of Tatars took place in 1418, mainly in Plovdiv, in the vicinity of Asanovgrad and other areas. The most numerous were the Yambol Tatars, who were covered in 34 ojaks. The third wave of Tatar resettlement was in 1515. It was then that a significant number of Tatars settled in the whole of northern Bulgaria, from the Black Sea to Vidin. Quite a few Tatars came to the Bulgarian lands from the Crimea and southern Russia. The settlement of the Tatars continued in the following centuries. In the 17th century, numerous groups arrived in northeastern Bulgaria and in particular in Shumen. Descendants of Shahin Giray, who left the Crimean Khanate in 1784, after living with him for some time in Istanbul, moved to Varbitsa, Shumen region. Until the middle of the 20th century, their grandchildren lived here in the specially built palace. Even in the 19th century, Tatar and Circassian villages were established on Bulgarian lands. Tens of thousands of Tatars and Circassians, expelled from Russia after the Crimean War, were settled in Thrace and northern Bulgaria, especially in Dobruja. The Tatars, including those who were included in the military organization of the Eunuchs, lived separately for a long time. Later, however, most merged with the Eunuchs. The presence among the Eunuchs of Tatars and other Turkic representatives, as well as people from the local population, is used by some researchers to dispute their Turkic character as a whole, and to downplay their role in the formation of the Turkish community in Bulgaria. In particular, at least 1/5 of the Eunuchs are said to be of non-Turkic origin, as they are recorded as sons of Abdullah. However, this hypothesis is difficult to prove. The use of the name Abdullah, servant of God, is not indicative enough, as it is a widespread Muslim name. Moreover, even these authors are forced to accept that the majority of Eunuchs are of Turkic origin. The Ottoman historian Orich Bey described them as an Oghuz nomadic tribe as early as the 15th century. Linguistic, ethnographic, and folklore sources confirm their Turkic ethnogenesis. For Vera Mutafjeva, they are unconditionally Turks by ethnicity. Therefore, a fairly large contingent of Turkic and Turkish populations were settled in the Balkans under the name Eunuchs. According to Gökbilgin's calculations, they numbered between 100 and 160,000 people. Eunuch settlement was only one form of colonization. Colonization was also carried out by sending military garrisons, administrative and religious officials, and other military feudal representatives. The centralized administrative and economic system, and the military organization revealed considerable possibilities in this regard. At the beginning, land was considered state property and was distributed as timar, zemit and has for the payment of certain administrative and military services. The newly conquered lands in the Balkans were also distributed to Sipahis and high-ranking officials. The representatives of Sipahis moved to the Bulgarian lands to take advantage of this system. That's how fiefs arose in this region. Their owners settled together with their families in one of the villages belonging to them. The owners of large fiefs, hosses, and zemits settled in the cities close to their possessions. The other forms of land ownership, mulk and vakufs, property and foundations, also contributed to the expansion of colonization. Mulk holders, who were actual owners of the land concerned, were interested in expanding their holdings and better cultivating them. The main source of increasing their income was the hiring of more labor. Therefore, the mulk owners settled hundreds of captives, who became ordinary peasants as soon as they converted to Islam. Another form of colonization was the establishment of military garrisons in newly conquered lands. The garrisons were distributed throughout the territory of Bulgaria. They settled mainly in the main and strategic cities and provided the protection of the fortresses and the approaches to the center of the empire, and to its borders. In the process of their completion, significant Turkish masses were also transferred to the Bulgarian lands. Especially in the later era, military and administrative offices were held only by Muslim Turks. Migration was also attractive to people not in military or administrative positions, such as artisans and farmers. Moving to more fertile lands provided them with an opportunity to enrich themselves and move into another social category. It should be taken into account that as a result of the conquest campaigns of Genghis Khan in the 13th century, a large Turkic-speaking population moved to Anatolia. Here it ended up in a fairly densely populated area. Migration helped a part of this population to escape from the complex socio-economic situation. At that time, the journey of the Kizilbash to northeastern Bulgaria began. This Turkic nomadic tribe inhabited northeastern Iran, more precisely the area known as Khorasan. Here the Kizilbash came under the influence of Islam, professed by the Iranians, as well as their culture. Threatened by the advancing Mongols, in the 13th century some of these Turkic tribes went west. They settled in the border regions of Iran with the Ottoman Empire. Quite a few Alevis lived on the territory of the empire itself. Their doctrine differed from the official Islam of the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire, for its part, was in constant conflict with Shiite Iran. Therefore, in the 16th century, during the wars of Selim I and Suleiman I with the Iranian Shah Ismail, from Anatolia to Rumelia, including Dobruja and Dili Orman, a restless Kizilbash population was transferred. Their dervish preachers settled mainly in villages and in desolate forest areas, where they established their tekkes. Thus, in the Ottoman period, a significant Turkish ethnic element was established on the Bulgarian lands. These were military contingents, administrative and religious officials, and a nomadic pastoral rural population who found their new homeland here. Settlers settled in both cities and villages. As a result of this migration, the ethnic appearance of the cities changed. Some new towns also arose, such as Tatar, Pazardzik, Sevlievo, Kriva Palanka, Momchilgrad and others. The new cities arose either by the Sultan's will or spontaneously. It can be seen from the special research of the Dutch historian Marshal Kiel. Sevlievo arose spontaneously in the last decade of the 16th century in the middle of a flat open field where Turkish colonists moved. The first records of the town with the Turkish name Selvi, Cyprus, date from 1516. The register records 18 households, all with Turkish Muslim names. In all probability the city was founded shortly before this. The rate of growth of its population confirms the combination of the two forms: colonization from outside and inclusion of a part of the local population to Islam. The change in the ratio between the Muslim and Christian population in the 15th and 16th centuries is irrefutable evidence of an influx from outside. According to geographer Ivan Bataklev, Momchilgrad arose in the last decades of the 17th century, or in the first decades of the 18th century on the initiative of the representatives of the Sultan's rule. According to the legend, the city began to be formed after Mestan Ali, the governor of the district who arrived from Asia Minor, built his residence in the area of Dutluk, Mulberry Field. As a result of the emergence of new towns and new hamlets in the existing settlements, in the 17th century the Muslim population began to predominate in them. Colonization gradually covered the villages. The newly arrived peasants settled mostly in depopulated areas, around the estates of some feudal lords. Hundreds of new villages thus arose. Colonization was stronger in northeastern Bulgaria and in general in the whole of northern Bulgaria from Shumen to Vratsa, gradually decreasing towards the west. It was quite noticeable in northern Thrace from Itaman to the sea, in southeastern Thrace and Thessaloniki. The highlands were also affected. In other words, the colonization process covered almost all of Bulgaria and led to significant changes in the structure of the population. The spread of Islam also led to changes, but not so much in the ethnic as in the religious structure. Although limited, the statistical data leave no doubt that the number of Muslims in absolute and relative terms has been growing continuously. There are various explanations for the reasons for this increase. Quite a few researchers from Bulgaria and other Balkan countries explained, and some still continue to explain this phenomenon with the forceful Islamization. This hypothesis became dominant in the period of the so-called revival process, because the policy of the Bulgarian Communist Party, BCP, in the field of historiography demanded that the forcible imposition of Islam be emphasized by all means. The limitation of the source material also contributed to the confirmation of this hypothesis. The lack of direct evidence of a mass violent imposition of Islam as a pre-prepared targeted action has previously led a number of authors to the conclusion that the spread of the Muslim faith was voluntary and over a long period. This concept became dominant towards the last decade of the 20th century. A number of Bulgarian and foreign researchers, on the basis of new source material, substantiated the thesis of acceptance of Islam by the population for various reasons, by personal choice, individually, as a family or collectively in a given village or city. The question of the reasons motivating personal and voluntary choice, however, still remains debatable. Quite a few historians explain the change of religion solely with the economic interests of an individual or a social stratum, with the privileges that Muslims had in Ottoman society. Still others believe that the absolutization of economic factors is wrong. As Mashal Keel points out, it should be borne in mind that in the 15th and 16th centuries, Islam was a modern religion, and the prestige of the Ottoman Empire was quite high. Many probably thought that Islam was the last message of God and therefore preferred it. Islam spread most quickly and effectively among the Turkic population. The Ottomans found a significant Turkic population on the Bulgarian lands, especially in northeastern Bulgaria. The commonality of origin and language connected them with the Ottoman Turks and with their religion. Based on this, the Bulgarian Ottoman scholar Valeriy Stoyanov writes, almost everywhere, where one can talk about post-Muslimization and Turkification, there are actually traces of pre-Ottoman Turks. During the Ottoman invasion, the population of Bulgaria was not sufficiently united not only in ethnic, but also in religious respect. As noted by Spurdan Polozov and Murin Drinov, the conversion was not comprehensive, and many remnants of paganism were preserved. On the eve of the Ottoman invasion in Bulgaria, as well as in other Balkan countries, the heresies of Paulism, Hesychasm and Bogomilism were quite widespread. Both heretics and pagans were religiously, psychologically, and politically susceptible to Islam. All heresies had deviated greatly from official Christian dogma. According to the Bogomils, the visible world was created by the forces of evil and was therefore imperfect. They rejected such religious institutions as churches and temples, the cross, the priesthood, and a number of rites. Their teachings contained elements of Manichaeism such as dualism, which brought them closer to Middle Eastern religions. That is why Bogomilism was persecuted by the official authorities and the church. His followers were deprived of the opportunity to freely profess their faith. Undoubtedly, in this situation, the population professing Bogomilism welcomed the establishment of Ottoman power as a deliverance. The majority of this population converted to Islam and quickly mastered the Muslim ritual system. Ottoman records record that it was the followers of the heresies who were the first of the natives to convert to Islam. The new religion was also successful among those who were still under the strong influence of paganism. Economic incentives also played a role. But in the first period they mainly influenced the local ruling class. Not a few of the Bulgarian boyars, accepting Islam, kept their estates and joined the ruling class of the Ottoman Empire. Among them was the son of the last Bulgarian king Ivan Shishman, Alexander Shishman, who under the name Suleiman Pasha was appointed as the governor of the Aydın region. Many offices and advantageous places in the state hierarchy were by unwritten rule granted to aristocrats who converted to Islam. During the 623-year Ottoman rule, there were 215 Grand Viziers, prime ministers. Of them, only 78 were Turks, and the remaining 137 were foreigners who converted to Islam. In the second period, however, more and more subjects converted to Islam due to socio-economic reasons. Inequality existed between Muslims and non-Muslims. As Zia Carroll notes, some represented, so to speak, the first, and the others, the second category of subjects. The participation of non-Muslims in governance was severely limited. They paid the additional jizya poll tax, and in a certain period also the devshirme blood tax. After the acceptance of Islam, not only were they freed from additional burdens, but there was an opportunity for them to move to a higher social category and to strengthen their own economic positions. The desire for a better life motivated many local people to convert to Islam. The Ottoman ledgers from 1679 to 1680 testify that in the area of Edirne in just 1 year, 379 people converted to Islam. In a large part of the requests, the conversion to Islam was motivated by the desire to receive services or acceptance into the Ottoman army. In the Ottoman archival collection of the St. Cyril and Methodius National Library, there are many such personal petitions from the first half of the 19th century. The central government, for its part, indirectly encouraged this process. Especially during the period of the 14th to 17th centuries, it did not pursue a purposeful and systematic policy of Islamization. From an economic point of view, it had no interest in a mass imposition of Islam. Undoubtedly, some forms of the spread of Islam were connected to the activities of the state. Such an administrative form was the Janissary system. As Ashok Pashazade notes, the Janissary system arose during the reign of Murad I, 1359 to 1389. Then a fifth of the Christian captives were turned into Ajami Oghlan and brought up in Turkish families or in special schools. Later, the so-called blood tax, devshirme, was imposed, which in practice meant taking boys from non-Muslim families, who had more than one child. In the 15th and 16th centuries, this policy was applied quite intensively. Towards the end of the 16th century, the system of filling the Janissary corps was changed. It began to be recruited from the sons of the Janissaries themselves and other Muslims. After the abolition of the ban in the 20s of the 16th century, the Janissaries began to create their own families and offspring. The families of ordinary Muslims voluntarily responded to the invitation to fill the children's lists, because in this way they ensured a better future for their descendants in the ranks of the Ottoman army. Gradually, Janissary became a privileged class with a number of benefits. According to Ottoman sources, the number of Janissaries in the 15th century was 10,000, in the 16th century, 13,000, and in the 17th century, 53,000 people. Towards the end of the 17th century, the corps began to gradually shrink, and in the middle of 1826 was finally dissolved. Its members blended into the rest of the subjects of the Ottoman state. The institution of slavery was also one of the forms of spreading Islam. Islamic ethics declare it a pious deed to free slaves after they convert to Islam. The closing phrase of the documents for the release of the slaves read, "Henceforth let him be free like other free Muslims." In this way, in the 17th century, quite a few new groups entered the Muslim communities. However, this form was more voluntary than obligatory. Cases of violence, as evident from the posts, appear to have occurred. However, they were not so massive. Administrative violent measures were applied on specific occasions, suppressing the riots of the non-Muslim population, during wars, especially during the clash between the military forces of the Ottoman and Russian empires. It is not excluded that individual sultans such as Murad IV and some others planned mass forcible Islamization. However, the higher religious circles, ulama, including Shaykhul Islam, opposed such intentions, as they contradict the Sharia. Despite the existence of similar facts, certain Bulgarian authors such as P. Petrov, N. Mizov and others continue to defend the hypothesis of a mass violent change of religion. The spread of Islam in Bulgaria, and especially in the Rhodopes, is explained exclusively by the use of violence. This thesis is based on a very limited circle and not so reliable source material. The Chronicle of Priest Metody Draginov. The story of the Russian scholar Lemansky, the second ruin of Bulgaria. The Dryanovsky transcript of Historia Slaviano-Bulgarskaya by Paisi Hilandarsky. And the so-called historical notebook. A number of famous Bulgarian historians such as Vasil Kanchov, Murin Drinov and Petr Mutavchiev considered these sources to be authentic and used them in their works. However, in light of the new studies, they seem rather doubtful. With the exception of the Dryanovsky transcript, the researchers do not have the originals of the other sources. For example, no one except the publisher, since 1870, has seen the original of the 2 pages containing the narrative of priest Metody Draginov, considered the most important of all sources for the violent spread of Islam. after establishing that the document was composed at the beginning of the 19th century, and it tells about events from the 17th century, the linguist Ilya Todorov rejects the thesis that it is original. For her part, Vera Mutavcheva, based on the fact that Chapinsko at that time was part of a Varkuf founded by Sultan Suleiman, 1510–1566, came to the conclusion that this area could not have been Mohammedanized through fierce violence. Neutral archival sources, as well as Ottoman records, refute the claim of the spread of Islam through mass violent action. Lemansky's The Second Destruction of Bulgaria is also an unreliable source, where it is told about the forcible Islamization of all the lands from the Aegean coast to Nevrokop, Gotsa-Delchev, as well as a large part of Danubian Bulgaria during the time of Sultan Selim I. In the short Byzantine chronicles, however, Selim I is presented as a ruler who treated Christians with respect. With a general order, he allowed the restoration of all the old churches. In the 16th century and even towards the middle of the 17th century, Christians still lived in Krupnik, which according to Lemansky was forcibly Islamized. Nowhere in the Ottoman sources is it mentioned that Selim I undertook a mass campaign to spread Islam in Bulgaria. As for the historical notebook, which describes very cruel and fantastic horrors, this source has long been doubted. Names of rulers, dates, etc., which are given there do not correspond to historical facts. It speaks of Bishop Vazarian, who ruled over the episcopate of Krastogori, which never existed. The presence of such unreal facts gave P. Marinov grounds to challenge the authenticity of the historical notebook, as early as 1977. Marshall Keel came to the same conclusion. According to him, these facts and events are a product of the imagination from the beginning of the 20th century and were written for a political purpose. The analysis of the Ottoman registers, referring to individual years from the 16th to the middle of the 19th century, confirms that the spread of Islam in Chapinsko was not the result of a one-time action, but of a process that lasted nearly 2.5 centuries. In two periods, it proceeded at an accelerated pace, around 1540 to 1560, a period coinciding with the time of great military victories of the empire, and around 1640, a period of deep crisis in the Ottoman state. The reasons that determined the spread of Islam are different. In all probability, in the first period the local population respected the military successes of the Ottoman Empire. In the second period, economic incentives came to the fore. For the spread of Islam in the Rhodopes, according to some researchers, coexistence with the Yuruks played an important role. Varkufs and dervishes contributed significantly to the spread of Islam. The Ottoman state provided them with empty land. Private individuals also made donations. Thus many Varkufs arose. Formerly, they were independent of state power and inalienable. The property they owned gave them the opportunity to create material prerequisites for the spread of Islam in the respective areas. The Varkufs became centers for establishing the Islamic way of life and for attracting new followers of Islam. In a number of cases, the rulers of the Varkufs were missionary dervishes. They started arriving on the Bulgarian lands together with the Ottoman army. The settlements they created became centers promoting the Islamic message. Gradually, the dervishes created religious centers in almost all regions of the Balkans. The conclusions about the causes and forms of the spread of Islam, which are made on the basis of new source material, fundamentally change the understanding of the essence of the so-called Islamization. It was not the result of a one-time mass and violent action, but a slow and prolonged process, which in most cases was not directed directly by the state power. The real content and historical significance of this process, as some researchers emphasize, is much more complex and multifaceted than is usually put into the concept of Turkification. Islamization does not always lead to Turkification everywhere. Such cases, as emphasized by Konstantin Jacek and L. Miltich, for example, have existed. But they should not be absolute. Islamization created certain prerequisites for Turkification. The new converts to Islam lost the marks of their previous ethnicity after a few generations and merged completely with the Muslim Turks, only if they fell into the necessary Turkish language environment. The history of the spread of Islam both in the Bulgarian lands and in the Balkans supports this statement. Albanians, Bosnians, and other nationalities after the adoption of Islam preserved their national identity. The Ottoman power was interested not so much in ethnic assimilation as in religious inclusion. Islam, like other world religions, is not a faith of a particular nationality and is therefore open to all ethnicities. Its ideologists until the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and some even now, do not consider the process of formation of national communities as a natural product of historical development. Therefore, when illuminating the ethnogenesis of the Turkish minority in Bulgaria, the role of Islamization should not be absolutized. A number of factors influenced the process of formation of the Turkish-Islamic mass in Bulgaria during the Ottoman period, among which colonization was of decisive importance. The period of Ottoman rule was characterized by a gradual increase in the number and relative share of the Turkish and Muslim population, and a corresponding decrease in Christians, especially in such areas as northeastern Bulgaria. The reasons for this process were complex: colonization, resettlement, change of religion, internal migration, etc. In certain historical periods, one of them played a decisive role. In the first decades after the establishment of Ottoman rule, some Bulgarians retreated to the mountains. The wars that broke out between the Ottoman Empire and other countries became catalysts for migration processes. Especially after the Russo-Turkish wars fought in the 18th and 19th centuries, many Bulgarians moved to Bessarabia, Russia, and other countries. Only after the Russian-Turkish War in 1829 to 1830, more than 100,000 people left the country. The Russian Empire encouraged this migration. After the wars that accompanied the narrowing of the borders of the Ottoman Empire, a reverse process began. A significant mass of Turks and Muslims left Hungary, Serbia, and other liberated countries and moved to the Bulgarian lands and Asia Minor. As a result, the Turco-Islamic mass grew significantly. An idea of this is given by the first census in the Ottoman Empire in 1831, which covered only the male population. According to the data from this incomplete census, the Christian male population represented 61.54% and the Muslim population 38.46%. In areas such as Plovdiv, Stara Zagora, and others, Christians predominated. In some others such as Rusay and Novi Pazar districts, Muslims. N. Todorov's calculations regarding the urban population in northern Bulgaria, based on the data from the 1866 census, basically confirmed this state of affairs. According to him, the Bulgarians in the northwest region were 50.5%, in the north-central, 64.1%, and in the northeast 32%. Muslims in the respective areas were 40.5%, 31.4%, and 53.3%. In the second half of the 19th century, the percentage of the Muslim population began to decrease. Significant changes in the demographic structure of the population occurred during the Russo-Turkish War in 1877 to 1878, and the first decades after it. Regardless of the fact that it had a liberating character for the Bulgarian people, and objectively helped to create a number of national states and above all the Bulgarian national state, the war was bloody and devastating in certain areas. It lasted 7 months, much longer than expected. Some battles became fierce. In the battles around Stara Zagora, at Shipka, and at Pleven, both sides suffered many human losses. The war also affected the entire civilian population. It was a severe test for the Turkish population. In the resulting war atmosphere and psychosis, it had to bear the adversities of the fact that it belonged to an opposing defeated country. Indeed, in separate places during the advance and retreat of the Ottoman or Russian army, respectively, the Bulgarian and Turkish populations provided each other with help and protection. There are historical documents, memories of participants in the war, which testify to the help provided by Bulgarians to their Turkish neighbors. Bulgarians defended their innocent fellow Turks before Russian soldiers or military courts, and protected the property of their neighbors who fled to the mountains. The examples of mutual assistance, of good neighborliness, however indicative, were not dominant. In a situation of war, the Turkish population was treated as a support of the Ottoman army. The memory of the suppression of the April Uprising, 1876, the atrocities of the Başıbozukes and others fueled anti-Turkish sentiments, and in many places provoked violence and terror. Extremely serious were the violence, robberies, massacres in 1877 to 1878, writes B. Dimitrov. According to some estimates, 400 to 500,000 Turks, Circassians, Tatars, Bulgarian Mohammedans died at that time. During the war, the property of the civilian population was seriously damaged. A number of villages were burnt and destroyed, and in others many public and private buildings were affected. In Tatar, Pazarcık alone, 938 private homes, mosques and schools were destroyed. The plight of the Turkish population was covered by many foreign journalists. In a telegram from the correspondent of the London newspaper Daily Telegraph it is said, "Yesterday around Vetovo I saw villages that were on fire. 200 people, fleeing from Svistov, were killed in Chayulu, Razgrad. In Ostranja and Koslovo, which are located 4 hours from Rusay, all the Muslims, among whom there were 31 children, were destroyed." Similar information was published in the newspapers Guardian, Norma, Correspondent and others. Such events also found a place in the reports of foreign diplomats. Sir A. Laird's extensive report to the English Parliament emphasized that many Turkish civilians had died in the war. In the report of the English representative in the commission established by decision of the Berlin Congress, to study the situation of refugees, it is noted that about 150,000 Muslims, terrified by the advancing Russian army, sought refuge in the southern regions of the Balkan Peninsula. Not a few of the refugees drowned in Maritsa. It happened that even mothers threw their children into the river, so about 2,000 children died. The committee members found many corpses around the river. The destruction and fires caused by the artillery, the looting and violence resorted to by the Russian soldiers in a number of places, created an atmosphere of uncertainty and panic. Therefore, many Turks and Muslims panicked and headed for Anatolia. According to various sources, the number of refugees varied from 600,000 to 1 million people. Indeed, some of the refugees later returned to their native places. But they found themselves in an atmosphere of hostility and uncertainty, which was created by the temporary Russian government and bandit groups. That is why a large part of them emigrated permanently to Turkey. The migration flow continued even after the war. However, a significant Turkish population remained in the Principality of Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia. According to the census data of January 19, 1881, there were over 900,000 Turks in the Principality of Bulgaria. In the northwestern part of the Principality, i.e. from the Yantra River to the east, including Tarnovo and Sevlievo, the Turks represented 49.4%. In the western part of the Principality they were 7.3%. In eastern Rumelia, Turks represented 34.5% of the population. Konstantin Jacek found a similar situation in the Rhodopes during his trip around the country in the early 80s of the 19th century. According to him, there is no ethnically pure Ottoman region like Karjali and the Arda River Valley. The analysis of the source material confirms that in the Ottoman period, a significant Muslim community was formed on the Bulgarian lands, the majority of which is a Turkish population. Part of this community was found by the Ottomans here. During the Ottoman rule, many colonists of Turkish and Turkic origin settled in Thrace, the Rhodopes and northern Bulgaria. As can be seen from the historical sources, they were joined in the course of several centuries by certain groups of the local population who accepted Islam mainly by their own choice. The process of the fusion of these three components was long and in different regions took place with different intensity. Until the Russo-Turkish War, 1877 to 1878, the community thus formed represented a part of the Turkish nation inhabiting the Ottoman Empire.